The desert stretched endlessly, silent and unforgiving. The wind carried dust across the dry ground, and the sun burned down without mercy. The cowboy had been riding for hours, his throat dry, his lips cracked, his body tired. The West was never kind to anyone, and yet he had chosen this path, because out here a man discovered who he really was. His horse's hooves crunched against the earth when he noticed something unusual near a large rock formation. At first he thought it was just another shadow against the stone, but as he got closer he saw movement. A figure leaned against the rock, still but trembling. Two smaller figures huddled close to her sides. His eyes narrowed. It was a woman and two children. The cowboy slowed his horse. He could see the woman's head tilt back, her chest rising unevenly, her hands clutching her side as if she were trying to hold herself together. The children clung to her arms, crying softly, their dark hair tangled by the wind. They looked up at him with wide, fearful eyes that spoke of hunger, exhaustion, and something worse, desperation. He stopped and climbed down, boots crunching on the sand. The rifle slung across his back rattled softly as he crouched near them. The older child, maybe 7 or 8 years old, looked directly at him. Her small hands shook as she pointed to her mother. Her voice cracked but came out firm, carrying the weight of fear that no child should have to bear. "Mama can't breathe," she said. The cowboy's heart sank. He looked at the woman. Her breathing was shallow, her lips pale, her eyes barely open. Her chest rose and fell in uneven bursts, and every breath seemed to cost her everything she had left. The younger child, maybe 5, pressed his face into his mother's arm. He whispered through tears, "Her ribs are broken." The cowboy felt the desert go silent. In that moment, the world around him disappeared. The wind, the heat, the endless emptiness, all faded. All he saw was a mother fighting for life and 2 children who could do nothing but watch. He reached for his canteen. Only a small amount of water remained inside, but he knelt and poured it gently into a tin cup, extending it toward her. The woman tried to sip but coughed, the pain in her chest twisting her face. The older child steadied her hand, whispering, "Please, Mama, drink." The cowboy could have walked away. Many men in the West would have. People told themselves stories to excuse their choices. They would say, "It's not my business," or "I can't help them all," and they would ride on. But something deep inside him refused to let him move. He thought of his own mother long ago, sick in bed, struggling to breathe while he was too young to help her. He remembered the helplessness in his chest when he realized nobody was coming. That memory had haunted him his whole life. He set his jaw and looked at the children. "She needs help. Do you understand?" He said gently. The older child nodded quickly, eyes full of tears but burning with hope. "Can you help her, mister?" The cowboy knew he was no doctor. He had no medicines, no bandages, no secret knowledge to heal broken bones. But he had something else, the refusal to let someone die when there was still a chance. He had seen enough death to know that sometimes survival depended less on medicine and more on will. He carefully pressed his hand against the woman's side. She winced, gasping, but she did not push him away. He felt the uneven shape beneath his touch, the broken ribs that made every breath a war. His chest tightened, but he kept his voice steady. "She's hurt bad, but we can help her breathe easier if we take it slow." The children leaned in, listening to every word as if he carried the wisdom of the world. They were so small, yet their faces carried the kind of courage only hardship could carve. The cowboy tore a strip from his shirt, rough fabric scratching against his skin. He tied it around her chest, just tight enough to give her ribs some support. She gasped again, but soon her breaths grew less erratic. Not painless, not safe, but steadier. The older child's lips parted in awe. "She's breathing better." The cowboy nodded. Relief washed over him, but only for a moment. He knew this was only the beginning. Out here, the desert took lives quickly. Without shelter, water, and rest, the woman would not last long. The children would not last either. "Where are you from?" the cowboy asked quietly. The older child pointed back across the horizon. "Our village. Far." Her voice trembled. "We were walking, but Mama fell. We tried to help her up, but she couldn't stand." The cowboy looked across the endless stretch of desert, knowing that their home might be too far to reach in her condition. He studied their small, tired faces and then glanced at his horse. He could carry 1 or 2, but not all 3, and leaving anyone behind was not an option. The desert heat pressed down on his back and sweat ran down his brow. He thought about the journey ahead. If he chose to help, it would not just be their fight, it would become his as well. He would be risking his own life, his own survival, for strangers. But as he looked at the children holding on to their mother's arms, whispering to her, refusing to let go even when hope was thin, he knew his choice had already been made. The cowboy adjusted his hat, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "We'll get her through this," he said firmly. The children stared at him as though he had spoken magic. Their shoulders, once heavy with despair, straightened. Their fear softened into something else, trust. The cowboy knew what that meant. When someone trusted you in the desert, it was not just trust in a man. It was trust in life itself, and he could not fail them. The sun lowered slowly, painting the sand in gold and red. The cowboy gave the woman another sip of water, saving only enough to keep her alive. He wrapped his coat around her shoulders to shield her from the evening chill that would come. The children nestled close, their small bodies trembling less now. As the stars began to prick the sky, the cowboy sat beside them, rifle resting against the rock, his eyes never leaving the horizon. He knew the night would be long, but he also knew this was only the beginning of their journey together. For the first time in years, the cowboy felt something stir in his chest, something stronger than survival, something more powerful than fear. He felt purpose, and though the desert stretched endlessly before them, he was no longer riding alone. The desert was quiet except for the shallow breaths of the woman and the soft whimpers of her children. The cowboy sat close, listening to every sound, his eyes fixed on her chest, rising and falling. Each uneven breath reminded him how fragile life could be. He had seen men fall in gunfights. He had seen horses collapse from exhaustion. But there was something different about watching a mother fight for air while her children clung to her. This was not a battle of bullets and steel. This was a battle of love and survival. The cowboy felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He was only one man. He had no medicine, no doctor's training, no supplies beyond what he carried on his horse. In his saddlebags there were bullets, rope, a half-empty canteen, and a piece of dried meat. None of these things could fix broken ribs. None could promise her tomorrow. Yet as he looked at the children, he knew that walking away would be more unbearable than facing the desert itself. The older child sat upright, her eyes never leaving her mother's face. Her hands kept brushing dust from her mother's dress as though keeping her clean could somehow keep her alive. The younger one leaned against his sister's shoulder, too tired to cry, his little body trembling. The cowboy had no children of his own, but in their faces he saw something familiar. Innocence caught in the storm of a world too cruel for them. He had been that boy once, watching helplessly as sickness claimed his mother. He remembered her eyes looking at him, full of love but fading with each day. And he remembered the emptiness afterward when she was gone. He had sworn he would never feel that helpless again. The cowboy reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a small piece of jerky. He handed it to the older child. She hesitated, glancing at her mother as if asking permission, then broke the piece in half and gave the smaller portion to her brother. They chewed slowly, their eyes filled with quiet gratitude. He noticed they gave nothing to themselves until their mother, with weak hands, motioned for them to eat. Even then, they ate carefully, as though saving strength for her. The cowboy's throat tightened. These children were carrying a weight no child should bear, and yet they carried it without complaint. The woman stirred, her eyes fluttering open. Her voice was barely more than a whisper, cracked and fragile. Why are you helping us?" she asked. Her words carried suspicion, but also something else, fear. In her life, strangers had likely not been kind. In the harsh land of the West, kindness was a rare and dangerous thing. The cowboy bowed his head for a moment before answering. "Because you need it," he said simply. He did not add more. He knew words were easy, but in the desert, actions carried the truth. She closed her eyes again, her breathing shallow, but he saw the tension in her shoulders ease just slightly. She had been holding on, waiting for something, and maybe, just maybe, she believed now that they would not be left to die alone. The night grew colder. The cowboy took off his coat and placed it gently over the woman. He knew he would shiver without it, but her body was too weak to fight the chill. The children curled close to her side, tucking themselves beneath the coat's folds. The cowboy kept watch, his rifle across his lap, eyes scanning the darkness. Out here, coyotes prowled at night, and sometimes worse, men with darker hearts than the beasts of the desert. He knew he could not sleep. Their safety depended on him. Hours passed. The stars burned bright above, cold and sharp against the black sky. The cowboy's thoughts wandered as he listened to the slow rhythm of her breathing. He thought of choices and the weight they carried. Every man in the West was defined by his choices, and this was his. He could have stayed on his path, thinking only of himself, but something stronger held him here. It was not just pity, and it was not pride. It was the memory of loss, the ache of his own helplessness as a boy, and the chance now to stand where no one had stood for him. At one point, the older child shifted closer to him. She whispered, "Do you think Mama will live?" Her voice cracked, trembling with both fear and hope. The cowboy hesitated. He wanted to tell her yes, wanted to promise it, but promises in the desert were dangerous things. Instead, he placed a hand on her small shoulder. "We're going to do everything we can," he said. His voice was steady, and she seemed to draw strength from it, nodding before curling back beside her mother. By dawn, the cold faded, replaced once more by the brutal heat of the sun. The cowboy's eyes stung from lack of sleep, but he stood and stretched, adjusting his hat against the glare. He filled his tin cup with the last drops of water and gave them to the woman. She drank slowly this time, managing a few swallows before leaning back. Her lips trembled, but a small sound escaped them. "Thank you." The cowboy said nothing, but inside, he felt the heaviness in his chest shift. Gratitude in a place like this was more than words. It was trust, fragile but real. He looked across the desert. The horizon shimmered with heat, endless and empty. Somewhere out there was shelter. Somewhere out there was safety, but it would be a long, punishing walk. He turned back to the children. "We'll have to move," he said. "She won't make it if we stay here." The older one nodded quickly, determination flashing in her tired eyes. She was ready to do whatever it took, even if it meant carrying the weight of the desert on her shoulders. The younger child clutched her hand, silent but following her lead. The cowboy knelt beside the woman.
"It's going to hurt," he told her gently.
"But we need to move you." She opened her eyes, pain shadowing them, yet she gave the faintest nod. She had no strength for words, but her will was still alive. He fashioned a sling from his saddle blanket, wrapping it carefully around her chest and waist. With effort, he lifted her, her body trembling in his arms. The children rushed to steady her legs, their little hands doing all they could to help. Together they began the slow journey forward, step by step across the barren land. Every step was heavy, every breath of hers sharp with pain, but the cowboy did not falter. The children did not complain. They walked with him, their small shadows stretching alongside his in the burning sun. And though the desert still stretched endlessly ahead, for the first time, they were not walking alone. They were walking together, bound not by blood but by choice, by the refusal to surrender to helplessness. The cowboy felt the weight of the woman in his arms and the eyes of the children on his back. It was heavy, yes, but it was also something else. It was purpose. And with every step forward, he knew that this burden was not breaking him. It was shaping him into something stronger. The sun rose higher, and the desert turned into a furnace. Every step was a struggle, every breath a reminder of pain. Yet the cowboy pressed forward with the woman leaning against him and the children walking close by. The heat shimmered on the horizon, making the earth look like it was melting into the sky, but there was no water ahead, no shade, nothing to promise comfort. He knew the desert could kill not with a sudden blow, but with slow and merciless patience. It was a land that asked men what they were made of, and many failed to answer. The cowboy looked at the woman and her children and knew he could not allow failure. He had seen too many lives lost because others chose not to act. Too many people turned away because kindness was harder than cruelty. As they walked, he thought of the towns he had passed through. In saloons, men drank until they forgot the faces of their own families. In dusty streets, strangers passed each other without a word. And in every corner of the West, people were learning to look away when someone cried for help. Indifference had become a habit, a shield against the pain of others. He had carried that shield once himself, convincing his heart that survival meant caring only for his own skin. But seeing the children's eyes wide and trusting, stripped that shield away. Out here in the middle of nowhere, there was no one else, no town, no law, no neighbor. There was only him. If he chose to look away now, then what was he but another empty man? Another soul swallowed by the West. The woman stumbled, her body shivering with every step, and the cowboy tightened his arm around her to keep her from collapsing. He could hear her ribs grinding with each breath, And though he wanted to shield the children from that sound, there was no way to hide the truth. The older child pressed her lips together, her face set with determination far beyond her years, while the younger one dragged his feet, whispering prayers under his breath that his mother would not leave them. The cowboy felt their faith pressing on him like an invisible weight. They believed in him now completely, and that belief was heavier than any rifle he had ever carried. At midday, he stopped near a cluster of dry bushes. It was not shade, not real relief, but it was enough to give them a moment's rest. He lowered the woman gently, adjusting the makeshift bandage around her ribs, and gave the last of his water to the children. He watched them drink slowly, each taking tiny sips, then pressing the cup back to their mother's lips before allowing themselves another swallow. He thought of men he had seen fighting over whiskey in town, spilling it carelessly on the floor, and the contrast burned in his chest. These children, who had nothing, carried more dignity than men with pockets full of silver. The cowboy's throat ached with thirst, but he said nothing. He had learned long ago that true strength was not in demanding comfort, but in giving it away when others needed it more. As he watched the woman close her eyes, resting against the stone behind her, he made a silent promise. He would not let them die in this desert, no matter the cost. The silence of the land was broken by a distant howl. Coyotes. The children stiffened, their eyes darting around, fear flickering across their tired faces. The cowboy reached for his rifle, steadying it across his knees. The animals were far, but he knew they followed weakness, drawn to the scent of suffering. They would not attack while he was alert, but he could not let his guard down. He felt the cruel truth of the West once again. Out here, mercy was rare, and predators came in many forms. As the day dragged on, the cowboy urged them back onto their feet. The woman's legs shook with each step, but she leaned into him, drawing on his strength as if it were her own. The children walked close, their small hands sometimes gripping his coat as though afraid he might vanish if they let go. Step by step, they moved forward, slower than the desert sun, but moving nonetheless. He thought of the phrase he had heard in countless saloons, muttered by men too weary to care. "It ain't my problem." That was the anthem of indifference, the song of men who had given up on compassion. He wondered how many times these children had heard those words before he came along. He wondered how many riders had seen them from a distance and chosen to turn their horses another way. The thought filled him with quiet anger, not the kind that burned quickly and faded, but the kind that settled deep in the bones and sharpened a man's resolve. By late afternoon, their shadows grew long and exhaustion pulled at every step. The cowboy carried more of the woman's weight now, her strength dwindling, but still she clung to life, breathing in shallow gasps. The children spoke less, their voices dry from thirst, but they stayed close, their little feet stumbling yet never stopping. Their courage amazed him. They were too young to understand the depth of their suffering, yet old enough to understand the meaning of holding on. When the sun finally dipped lower, painting the sky in streaks of orange and red, the cowboy found a small rise in the land, where stones could shield them from the night wind. He set the woman down carefully, covering her once more with his coat, and sat beside her. The children leaned against him this time, their bodies trembling with exhaustion. He let them, knowing that sometimes strength was not in walking tall, but in allowing yourself to rest against someone you trusted. He stared out at the horizon, rifle resting beside him, and thought about what it meant to stand against the West. It was not about drawing a gun faster than another man or claiming land through blood. It was about something quieter, something harder. It was about refusing to be indifferent when the world told you it was easier to look away. It was about carrying another's weight when your own back already ached. It was about believing that life, no matter whose, was worth saving. The night came, cold and merciless. Stars filled the sky, sharp and distant, and the children drifted into sleep beside their mother. The cowboy kept watch, his body aching, his throat dry, but his heart steady. For the first time in years, he felt certain of who he was. Not a drifter, not just a survivor, but a man who chose to stand where others turned away. And as he looked at the sleeping faces beside him, he knew that this was not just their fight anymore. It was his. The morning sun rose like a fiery crown above the desert, casting its light on the cowboy and the small family who leaned on him for survival. He had not slept through the night, his eyes fixed on the horizon, his hands tight on the rifle that lay across his lap. The coyotes had howled again, circling just out of sight, but they had kept their distance, sensing his watchful presence. When the first rays of sunlight touched the sand, The cowboy knew their fight was far from over. The woman was still alive, her breathing shallow but steady, and the children stirred beside her, rubbing their tired eyes and clutching her arms as if to make sure she had not slipped away during the night. The cowboy's body ached from exhaustion. His lips were dry, his throat parched, and his muscles burned from carrying her weight across the barren ground. His canteen was empty, and his supplies had run low. But when he looked at the woman and her children, he understood what had to be done. Out here, survival meant sacrifice, and the only way forward was to risk what little he had left. He rose slowly, dust clinging to his clothes, and knelt beside her. "We need to move," he said softly. "If we stay, the desert will take us all." Her eyes fluttered open, dark with pain, but she gave the faintest nod. She knew as well as he did that resting meant dying. The children looked at him with wide eyes, their trust unbroken, their hope tied to his every word. He could not let them see fear in his face. He could not let them believe he doubted their chance. He tore another strip from his saddle blanket and tightened the bandage around her ribs. She winced, gasping for air, but the steady rhythm returned, enough for her to stand if he guided her. With effort, he lifted her to her feet, her frail body leaning against him, and gestured for the children to stay close. Together they set off once more into the endless desert, step by step beneath the merciless sun. The cowboy knew every choice carried risk. His water was gone, his horse weary, and his own strength fading. Yet he gave every drop of energy he had to keep them moving. He offered his shoulder for the woman's weight even when his back screamed in protest. He slowed his pace for the children even though he longed to push forward faster. He gave them everything because that was what survival demanded. Not selfishness, but sacrifice. Hours passed, the land stretching before them like an endless trial. The heat pressed down like an iron hand, and every shadow seemed to dance and disappear. The cowboy's vision blurred, but he pressed forward, knowing that if he faltered, they would too. He thought of his past, of the times he had chosen himself over others, of the nights when regret had haunted him. This was his chance to set it right. This was his chance to prove that he was not just another man swallowed by the indifference of the West. By midday, the woman collapsed against him, her legs refusing to carry her further. He lowered her gently to the ground, shielding her face from the sun with his hat. The children knelt beside her, their small hands shaking her arm, their voices cracking as they whispered for her to hold on. The cowboy's chest tightened, a storm of helplessness pressing against his ribs, but he refused to surrender. He scanned the horizon, searching for anything, any sign of water, any scrap of shade. His eyes caught a faint shimmer in the distance, the glimmer of what might be a creek or a spring. It could have been a mirage, another cruel trick of the desert, but it was hope, and that was enough. He turned to the children. "Stay with her," he said firmly. "Do not leave her side. I'll come back." The older one grabbed his hand, fear burning in her eyes. "What if you don't?" she whispered. The cowboy crouched, meeting her gaze. "I will," he said. "I promise." And for the first time in years, he felt the weight of a promise he could not break. He mounted his horse and rode hard toward the shimmer on the horizon, the heat lashing at him, the desert testing every ounce of his will. His throat burned, his head pounded, but he pressed forward until at last he found it. A narrow stream hidden between rocks, the water flowing clear and real. Relief flooded him, but he wasted no time. He filled his canteen, his hat, even his hands, drinking deeply before leading his horse to drink. Then he turned back, urgency burning in his chest. When he returned, the children were still clutching their mother, their eyes wide with fear, but lighting with hope when they saw him. He knelt, pouring water into her cracked lips. She drank slowly, coughing at first, then swallowing. The children drank next, their faces softening as life returned to their tired bodies. The cowboy drank last, only enough to steady himself, then set the canteen aside. They rested, but he knew they could not stay. Night would bring cold and predators, and her broken ribs would not heal here in the dust. He lifted her once more, her body trembling, and together they continued forward. The children walked beside him, their small hands brushing his arm, their eyes fixed on him as if he were the only thing anchoring them to life. Every step cost him, but he gave it willingly. He knew he was risking his own life with each sacrifice, but that was the choice he had made. To stand against indifference meant more than words. It meant carrying another when your own legs were weak. It meant giving your share of water even when your lips burned with thirst. It meant risking your tomorrow so that someone else could have theirs. As the sun dipped low again, painting the desert in red and gold, the cowboy felt the weight of exhaustion pressing harder than ever. Yet when he looked at the children and their mother, still breathing, still fighting, he knew that no risk was too great. He was no longer just a man crossing the desert. He was their shield, their strength, and their hope. And for the first time in his life, he understood that risking his own life was not loss. It was the only way to truly live. The desert stretched before them like an endless trial, and by now the cowboy's body was worn from days without proper rest. Yet when he glanced at the children walking beside him, he found a reason to keep stepping forward. Their small feet dragged across the sand, their faces flushed with heat, but their hands never let go of their mother's arm. The older girl carried herself with a seriousness that seemed far beyond her years, her chin lifted in quiet determination. The younger boy clung to her side, his eyes weary but steady, whispering words of encouragement to his mother even though he was only a child himself. The cowboy realized in that moment that strength did not always wear the face of age or size. Sometimes strength lived in the hearts of children who refused to give up. The woman leaned heavily against him, her broken ribs making each breath a battle. Yet she did not collapse. Her children's presence gave her something to hold on to, a reminder of why she had to keep fighting. The cowboy watched the way her hand, though weak, reached for their small fingers as if drawing power from their touch. It humbled him. He had seen men twice her size fall to despair after smaller trials, yet here she was, carrying the weight of pain while still trying to protect her children with every gasp of air she could draw. As the sun beat down on their backs, the children took turns walking closer to their mother, speaking to her softly, trying to distract her from the pain. The girl told stories about their village, about how Mama would sing in the evenings, about how she would braid her hair while the boy laughed at silly songs. The boy tried to recall the names of every star he had heard his grandfather mention, whispering them one by one as if each name had the power to keep his mother alive until nightfall. The cowboy listened, his chest tightening. These children carried not just memories but hope, and they were giving that hope back to their mother like a gift, piece by piece, to keep her spirit alive. The cowboy had always believed survival belonged to the strongest, the fastest, the men who could fight or shoot or ride harder than anyone else. But here in the middle of a merciless land he saw something different. Survival came from love, from a daughter who steadied her mother's steps when her own legs shook, from a son who whispered comfort even when his own lips were cracked with thirst, from a family who refused to break apart, no matter how hard the desert tried to scatter them. They stopped at a small rise of land where dry grass grew between stones. It offered little shade, but it was enough for a brief rest. The cowboy laid the woman down gently, adjusting the bandage on her ribs while the children immediately began searching the ground for anything useful. The girl found a stick and brought it back, asking if it could help their mother walk. The boy gathered a few strands of dry grass, setting them in a pile as if he could somehow start a fire without flint. The cowboy watched them with quiet respect. They were tired, starving, and frightened, yet they still searched for ways to help. They refused to sit idle while their mother suffered. The cowboy took the stick from the girl and carved the end flat with his knife, shaping it into a crude support. He placed it in the woman's hand, helping her lean against it as they prepared to move again. Her eyes, filled with pain, softened when they rested on her children. She did not need words to tell them how proud she was. Her love showed in the faintest smile, in the way she brushed her fingers against their cheeks. As they continued walking, the cowboy noticed the girl slowing her pace whenever her mother stumbled, her small body pressing against her side to steady her. He saw the boy carrying the blanket they had used to wrap their mother, dragging it through the dust without complaint, determined to lighten the load. Their shoulders were small, but the weight they carried was greater than most men would dare to bear. The cowboy thought of his own childhood, of nights spent feeling powerless, wishing he could have done more to save the one he loved. These children were living that same story, yet unlike him, they did not surrender to helplessness. They turned their fear into strength, their sorrow into determination. It moved something deep inside him, something he had long thought buried beneath years of loneliness and wandering. By evening, their steps grew slower, and hunger gnawed at all of them. The cowboy knew he had nothing left in his pack but a small crust of bread. Without hesitation, he handed it to the children. They broke it in half, offering it to their mother first. She tried to refuse, pushing it back into their hands, but they insisted. At last she ate a small bite, then made sure they finished the rest. The cowboy watched silently, knowing that love was feeding them more than food could. As night fell, the desert turned cold again. The cowboy set up what little protection he could, laying the blanket beneath the woman and letting the children curl close to her for warmth. He sat nearby, rifle across his knees, staring at the stars. The boy crawled closer, tugging at his coat sleeve. "Will Mama be all right?" the child asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. The cowboy looked at him, at the trust shining in his eyes, and answered as honestly as he could. "She's strong," he said. "And so are you. Together you'll help her through this." The boy nodded, seeming satisfied with the answer, and returned to his sister's side. The cowboy exhaled slowly. He had not lied. He had seen strength in them that few grown men possessed. They were carrying their mother's hope with every step, and that kind of strength could not be measured in muscles or weapons. As the fireless night stretched on, the cowboy realized something had changed within him. He was no longer just carrying the family through the desert. They were carrying him too. Their courage reminded him why life was worth fighting for, why standing against the indifference of the West mattered. For the first time in years, he felt he was part of something greater than himself, something that gave meaning to every step he took. When the dawn broke once more, the cowboy rose to his feet, his body aching but his spirit steady. The children helped their mother stand, their small shoulders braced against her as if they were pillars carved from stone. The cowboy adjusted his rifle and looked at the horizon. The desert was still vast, still merciless, but he no longer saw it as an enemy. He saw it as a test of love, of will, of human spirit. And as he looked at the children guiding their mother forward, he knew they would not fail. Because true strength was not in the size of a man or the power of his hands. True strength lived in the hearts of those who refused to give up, no matter how impossible the road ahead seemed, and in that strength, they walked on. The morning sun rose once more over the desert, burning gold across the endless sand, and the cowboy felt the weight of another day settle on his shoulders. He adjusted the bandage around the woman's ribs, made sure the children were steady on their feet, and then began leading them forward again. Each step echoed like a test of faith. The desert did not care about their struggle. It had taken stronger men before and left nothing but bones. Yet here they were, still moving, still defying its silence with every breath. The woman's body shook against him, her broken ribs stabbing at her lungs with each inhale. But she no longer fought just for herself. Every time her knees buckled, she would glance at her children, and the sight of them holding her hand seemed to pull her back from the edge. Pain had a way of swallowing a person whole, but love pulled her through it. The cowboy saw this and felt something shift inside him. He had always thought of pain as something to be endured alone, but now he realized it could be shared, and in sharing it, it became lighter. The children's resilience amazed him. The older girl walked ahead at times, scanning the horizon as if she could protect her family simply by watching. The boy, small and trembling, carried scraps of wood and dry grass he had collected, convinced that one day he would build a fire for them. They stumbled, they cried quietly when the heat became too cruel, but never once did they ask to stop. Their determination reminded the cowboy of the fire his own mother used to speak of, the fire of the human spirit, a flame that could burn even in the darkest places if it was fed with hope. As the day stretched on, their shadows grew long across the sand. The cowboy's throat ached with thirst, his legs trembled from exhaustion, yet he refused to slow his pace. He had already decided his life was worth risking, if it meant giving them a chance. He thought of the times he had been a drifter, moving from one town to another, fighting only for himself. His life then had been empty, shaped by regret and loneliness. But here, with every heavy step, he felt something he had not felt in years: purpose. In the late afternoon, the horizon shifted. The cowboy's sharp eyes caught the faint outline of smoke in the distance. His heart quickened. Smoke meant people, and people meant the possibility of water, food, and shelter. But it also meant risk. Not every settlement welcomed strangers, and a cowboy leading a native woman and her children could invite hostility. He had seen towns where men judged worth by skin and blood rather than humanity. He clenched his jaw. If there was danger, he would face it. He would stand between this family and anyone who tried to harm them. The woman noticed the smoke too, her lips trembling as though she wanted to ask, but did not have the strength. The children's eyes widened, a flicker of hope sparking in their tired faces. "Is it a village?" the girl whispered. The cowboy nodded. "Looks like it." He did not promise safety because safety was not guaranteed, but his steady voice gave them the assurance they needed. They continued toward it, step by step, the smoke growing clearer with each mile. The cowboy's heart pounded with both hope and caution. He thought of the West as fire, beautiful in the distance, destructive up close. It gave light, but it could also burn everything to ash, and now he was walking directly into it. By dusk, they reached the edge of a small settlement, a scattering of wooden shacks with smoke rising from their chimneys. The smell of cooked food drifted faintly through the air, making the children's stomachs growl. The cowboy steadied the woman against him, her head resting on his shoulder, her breath sharp with pain. He knew they needed help, and quickly. But he also knew strangers in the West could be more dangerous than the desert itself. As they stepped onto the dusty street, a few heads turned. Men leaned on porches, women paused from carrying water, and children stopped playing, their eyes fixed on the cowboy and the family beside him. The air grew tense. He felt the weight of their stares, sharp and measuring. The woman lowered her gaze, her body trembling not just from pain but from fear. The children clung tighter to her hands. The cowboy raised his chin, his expression steady. He knew what they saw, an outsider carrying the broken body of a native woman followed by her two children. In too many towns, that sight alone was enough to draw cruelty. But he would not flinch. He had carried them through the desert, and he would carry them through this fire as well. A man stepped forward, his eyes narrow, his tone suspicious. "What happened to her?" The cowboy's voice was calm, unshaken. "She's hurt. Broken ribs. She needs water and rest." The man's gaze shifted to the children, then back to the cowboy. His mouth curled in doubt, as though debating whether their lives were worth saving. The cowboy felt anger stir inside him, the same anger that had carried him through the desert, the refusal to accept indifference. He tightened his arm protectively around the woman and met the man's gaze. "She's not dying here," he said firmly. "Not while I stand." For a moment the air was thick with silence. Then an older woman emerged from one of the shacks, her face lined with years but her eyes steady. She carried a bucket of water and a cloth. Without a word, she knelt beside the family, wetting the cloth and pressing it gently against the woman's lips. The children watched with wide eyes as their mother drank, relief softening their faces. The cowboy gave the older woman a nod of gratitude. She did not return it with words but with quiet action, guiding them toward her home. Others watched but did not interfere. Perhaps they did not care, perhaps they judged, but the cowboy no longer concerned himself with their stares. All that mattered was that the family was safe for now. That night, as the woman rested on a straw bed and the children ate warm bread for the first time in days, the cowboy sat by the door, his rifle resting against the wall. He listened to their soft voices, the way the children whispered to their mother, the way she, though weak, tried to hum a tune to soothe them. It was a fragile sound, but it filled the small room with warmth stronger than any fire. The cowboy leaned back, his eyes heavy with exhaustion, but his spirit steady. He had carried them through the desert, walked into the fire of the West, and refused to bow to its indifference. He knew their journey was not over. The woman's ribs would take time to heal, and danger still lurked beyond the walls of this settlement. But tonight they were alive, and that was victory enough. As he closed his eyes, he understood something he had never realized before. Strength was not just about how far a man could walk or how much weight he could carry. True strength was measured in what you were willing to risk for others. He had risked his life, and in return he had found something greater than survival. He had found purpose, and he had found it in the courage of a mother, the hope of two children, and the quiet choice to stand when others would have turned away. And so he slept, knowing that tomorrow the fight would continue, but also knowing that they would not face it alone. The days in the small settlement passed slowly, yet each one carried the weight of survival. The woman lay on the straw bed, her ribs bound tightly with cloth, her breath still sharp but no longer fading. The older woman who had given them shelter tended to her with patience, bringing water, grinding herbs into pastes, and murmuring words of comfort in a language older than the West itself. The children stayed close, never leaving their mother's side except to fetch water or help prepare food. Their hands were small, but their hearts worked harder than most grown men the cowboy had ever met. The cowboy remained near the door each night, his rifle within reach, his eyes fixed on the horizon beyond the settlement. He knew that the world was not kind, and even here, in the safety of wooden walls, danger lingered. Yet for the first time in years, he did not feel alone. He had been a drifter, a shadow crossing the desert with no ties to anyone or anything. But now he felt tethered, not by chains but by choice. These children's laughter, fragile though it was, had become the sound that steadied him. The woman's quiet endurance reminded him that life was worth every painful breath. One evening, as the sun sank behind the hills, painting the sky in gold and violet, the older child approached him. She sat beside him on the porch, her thin arms wrapped around her knees, her eyes reflecting the fading light. For a long moment she said nothing. Then, in a voice both small and steady, she asked, "Why did you help us?" The cowboy looked at her, at the determination that burned in her young eyes. He thought of all the reasons: his own mother's death, the loneliness of his wandering, the injustice of watching the West swallow good people whole. But none of those seemed enough to explain what had carried him through the desert. He finally said, "Because it was the right thing to do." The girl studied him carefully, as though searching for more in his words. Then she nodded. "Mama says people don't always do the right thing, but she says when someone does, it changes everything." Her words cut deep, truer than anything he could have spoken himself. He realized then that his choice to stop in the desert to carry their mother, to give his water and strength, had not just saved them. It had rewritten the story of their lives. These children would never forget the moment a stranger chose them over indifference. Days turned into weeks. The woman's ribs healed slowly. Her breathing grew stronger and color returned to her cheeks. She was not the same as before, her movements careful, but she was alive. The children no longer whispered their fears of losing her each night. Instead, they laughed softly, helped her stand, and dreamed of returning to their village. The cowboy knew their time together was nearing its end. Soon, he would have to leave. That was the way of his life, never staying, always moving on. Yet the thought of leaving this family stirred something unfamiliar in him, a weight heavier than any he had carried before. He had become more than a stranger to them. He had become a shield, a guide, almost like kin. And though he had never sought family, he found himself wondering what it would mean to stay. The day finally came when the woman could walk on her own, leaning only lightly on a carved stick for support. She stood outside the small house, her children beside her, and looked at the cowboy with eyes filled not just with gratitude, but with something deeper, a recognition of the bond they now shared. "You saved us," she said simply, her voice still soft but steady. The cowboy shook his head. "You saved yourselves. I just walked with you." But the children would not let him dismiss it so easily. The boy tugged at his coat, his eyes bright. "No," he said. "You carried us. You carried Mama. Without you, we would have been lost." The cowboy knelt, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder, then looking at the girl whose eyes glistened though she refused to cry. "You are stronger than you know," he told them. "Remember that. The desert tried to break you, but you kept walking. Never forget what that means." They nodded, their young faces solemn, as if taking an oath they would carry for the rest of their lives. When it came time to leave, the cowboy saddled his horse quietly, the weight of farewell pressing heavier than any journey he had ever taken. The woman stepped forward, her children holding her hands, and together they stood before him. No words could capture what they felt, so instead she placed her hand over her heart and bowed her head. The cowboy tipped his hat, his throat too tight to speak. He rode out at dawn, the desert once again stretching before him, endless and silent. But this time the emptiness did not feel the same. Behind him he carried no possessions, no riches, but something greater, the memory of a family who had lived because he refused to walk away. Years later, long after the desert had taken its toll on his body, long after the towns and trails blurred together, stories of him remained. Around campfires and villages and among travelers, people spoke of the cowboy who stood against the West. Some said he was a ghost, some said he was just a man. But the ones who knew the truth told it differently. They told of the day a mother lay broken in the desert, her children crying by her side, and a stranger chose to stop. They told of how he carried them through the heat, through hunger, through danger, risking his own life for theirs. They told of how those children grew strong, how they remembered his words, and how they passed that memory down so no one would forget. And so his legacy lived on, not in gold or land, but in the lives he had saved and the strength he had inspired. He was not remembered for his gun or his horse, but for his choice, the choice to care in a land that had forgotten how. The cowboy never sought to be a hero, but in standing against indifference, he became something more. He became a reminder that even in the harshest desert, even in the fire of the West, one act of compassion could echo across generations. And though the desert swallowed his tracks, the memory of his footsteps lived forever in the hearts of those who walked beside him.